So a couple things about inverses that we learned this morning is that algebraically and graphically we can draw or find an inverse just by switching the x and the y values. So a lot of times if you're given a graph already, all you're going to need to do to graph the inverse is switch the x and the y values. So if we go from left to right here, our first point is negative 4, 4. When we switch x and y, so on the red graph we have negative 4, 4. That'll mean on our other graph we're going to have 4, negative 4. Our second point is negative 1, negative 1. When you switch those around, that point's going to stay the same. Now we have 1, 3. So switching those, we'll have 3, 1. And finally, the last point there is 3, 2. So now you'll have 2, 3. Connecting the dots, you have to remember which was your first, second, third, and fourth point, so you connect them in the right order. And we get the graph of our image, which is the inverse. One thing about the inverse, graphically, the inverse is always a reflection over the diagonal line y equals x. Put it in the bucket there. So can you see that if you flip the red line over that diagonal line that it would match up with the blue one? Okay? On your final exam, if you have a tough time flipping over a diagonal line, it is okay to turn your paper sideways, so it's a horizontal line, and then flip it over and then turn it back, and no one will ever notice that you cheated that way. So there's the graph of the inverse. Is that inverse function, is that inverse a function? How do you tell if something's a function or not? It has to pass the vertical line test. So if we draw a vertical line, whoops, that looks better. If we draw a vertical line and we go across, notice that the red graph, as that vertical line is going across, the red graph only touches that vertical line at one place. But on our blue graph, there are multiple places where, for example there, our blue graph is touching the vertical line twice. We even have some places like this where it's touching it 3 times. If a graph ever touches that vertical line more than once, it is not a function. So for B, we would say no. Oh! All right, so the inverse is not a function because it didn't pass that vertical line test. And now in part C, state the domain and range of both the function and the inverse. So if we look in our interval notation for domain and range, our smallest value was negative 4, and our biggest value was 3. For our range of our red graph, the smallest value is at negative 1, and the biggest value for our range is 4. Now when we look at our inverse image, now our domain goes from negative 1 to 4, and our range goes from negative 4 up to 3. What do you notice? They're just the same switched. Because your domain is your x values, your domain becomes your y values. And your range was your y values, they now become your x values. Because the big thing about inverses is that the x and y's just switch. Okay, the questions you can do for example 1 are 4 and 9.